you say that all projects coming out of Snøhetta will be carbon neutral within the next 15 years.
It's possible.
From unknown upstarts winning a prestigious commission, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina,
to receiving the Mies van der Rohe Award for the Opera House in Oslo.
Frontline thinkers who designed the National September 11th Memorial Museum Pavilion
and redesigned the iconic Times Square in New York City.
Meet Kjetil Thorsen, co-founder of Snøhetta.
High energy consumption buildings are going to fall in price, and good performative buildings are going to increase in price. So there will be a division in the market.
The biggest challenge of carbon neutrality is that there isn't enough data. What must change?
We need every producer to clearly describe how much CO2 is embedded in this product. I don't care if it's 0 or 100 kilos. I just need to know how much it is.
Do you think beauty matters?
I think it matters, but that changes. What I get happier looking at today is not the same as 20 years ago. When I was a student, we were interested in architecture as an art form. Now they're interested in architecture to be able to solve the problems.
A goal like this depends on so many things that are beyond your control.
A lot of it has got to do with attitudes. We have to make some major choices, maybe even to the extent that we cannot solve everything at the same time.
Knowledge has become fragmented. What do you do to correct this?
We try to get the specialists around the table and ask them to leave their professions. We call this method transpositioning. All of a sudden, you understand this is...
Welcome to Ecogradia, where we meet experts and practitioners at the front lines of sustainable architecture and urbanism. My name is Nirmal. I'm a sustainable design strategist, author, and educator based in Singapore. It is impossible to ignore Snøhetta, the Norwegian-based design firm that has become a global powerhouse. You'll see that it has something to do with how they frame the design process, how they tap disciplinary knowledge, how they link beauty with performance. Their projects are a feast for the eyes as much as the mind. Snøhetta is determined to find a way to get us from where we are today to the zero-carbon future we must achieve. The firm has a massive global footprint with projects on the drawing board now in numerous countries, which makes what they do and how they do it critical. Kjetil and his team at Snøhetta have the power to move the dial. The question is, will they? A quick reminder before we start, you can find images and notes to get more out of this episode at ecogradia.com. and highlights and links in the description pane on this page. And please, if you like what you hear, click on our subscribe button to keep the conversation flowing. Your support is key to rally top achievers from around the globe to come share with us their ideas, expertise, and insights on how to make our world, buildings and cities more sustainable, one blueprint at a time. And now, Kjetil Thorsen. Kjetil, welcome to the podcast. I'm really happy to have you here.
And I'm really happy to be here. You're a bit of a champion. So I'm really honored to be invited here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You say that all projects coming out of Snøhetta will be carbon neutral within the next 15 years. But a goal like this depends on so many things that are beyond your control, really. So walk me through this. Let's kind of break it down.
You're right. I mean, there are all good intentions and there are good results. And it's not necessarily always the same thing. So what we try to do is to establish a certain setting around how we work at the very beginning of a project, contextually and conceptually at the same time. And being continuously argumentative in direction of making sure that the others understand why we're doing it. We are depending on the world around us moving in parallel or even better in front of us. Because we can't change the world on our own. It's a total impossibility. But the ambition that you often go into when you define goals like that in a three-step kind of movement, 2029, be as precise as you can to have only carbon neutral projects on the drawing table. And 39, making sure that you only have them under construction, and 49, making sure that you only have such completed.
The biggest challenge of carbon neutrality today is that there isn't enough data. I mean, embodied energy for materials and products may be readily available in some countries, but in much of the world, it's not available. So if the goal is that we're going to get somewhere, what must change in the transparency of the supply chains? I mean, this is central to this idea, is it not?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole embodied discussion is a huge one. You know, you have two screws, stainless steel, exactly the same. One produced by this energy source and the other one by this. And you have to know the difference. You have to be able to calculate back the CO2 content of that particular element.
Exactly.
And it's a huge job. You know, if you look at the millions and millions of products out there, it's a huge job. So what you do logically is you limit yourself a little bit in the choice of materials that you have at hand. And you use those where you can follow the production line back and making sure that at some point, at least you have an average understanding of the CO2 embodied consumption in that material or in that product. And it's possible. It's possible. We have followed this throughout many years, and slowly there are many companies around there developing their own calculation programs for embodied energies. But it's still not a precise science. Right. So we need every producer in this world to produce a document of every product worldwide that clearly describes how much CO2 is embedded in this product. And I don't care if it's 0 or plus or 10 kilos or 100 kilos. I just need to know how much it is.
Will carbon neutral also become cost neutral? You know, because
yes,
there is this. It's a big question. I know developers in Asia who flinch at the idea of 30% energy efficiency.
In Europe, for the moment, I think we can actually produce a CO2 neutral over 30 years building with approximately 2 to 3% more cost.
Right.
So it's not significant, and with the future of sort of marking buildings that are performing and marking buildings that are not performing, there is also long-term economy in this for the developers. And I think they should be very aware that high energy consumption buildings are going to fall in price. And good performative buildings are going to increase in price compared to the two. So there will be a division in the market long-term where these things have different prices.
What do you think will drive this? Should I be looking out for policy change? Should I be looking out for shifts in public opinion? Should I be looking out for the way in which banks lend money? What do you think will drive this shift towards carbon neutrality?
I think policies, yes, for sure. I mean, there needs to be a public understanding, and I would say the EU is working quite hard, taxonomy, trying to make this work. We're seeing a lot of movements in the EU. Green cities development. We're seeing a lot of different types of policies coming out for the moment where it makes it easier to understand and differentiate whatever is environmentally sound and whatever isn't. Right. On the other hand, when it comes to the worldwide kind of decision-making, I think there's a certain urge. You know, it's the young people's urge that creates the change, not necessarily us, old men, you know. It's definitely part of the next generation, and we see an engagement that is, of course, much higher than when I was a student. We were interested in architecture as an art form. Now they're interested in architecture to be able to solve the problems ahead of us, really, which is a much more mature and much more knowledgeable attitude towards architecture. Because, you know, a lot of the students I meet now also are a little bit afraid of the future.
Yes.
So many things need to happen at the same time. The economies, the policies, the practitioners, and cross-professional at the same time. Working with the engineers, working with the scientists.
And public opinion, yeah.
And public opinion. But public opinion, you know, I mean, architects have a slow change, right?
Yes.
Public opinion is an even slower change.
Let's zoom in a bit more apart from carbon neutrality, there are several other things that you have said in the past that I'd like to unpack a little bit. One of which is that the knowledge has become fragmented. That, and a central position at Snøhetta is that we must find ways to reintegrate knowledge. And particularly you speak of architecture and landscape, because we find ourselves working in silos of expertise, right? What do you do in your company on a project to correct this?
Well, a lot of it has got to do with attitudes, right? So you have to start from the very beginning. Of course, when you get new people in, you have to bring them on board for them to understand really what does it mean to integrate. So we have introduced a couple of systems. We have IdeaWorks, which is a workshop methodology, where we try to get the specialists of different professions around the table and then ask them to leave their professions. We call this method transpositioning.
Right.
And transpositioning means if you're an engineer, defending your engineering skills around the table, when during creative processes, you are actually losing the effect of having the engineer around the table, because you want that person with all his skills. Let's say that person would be very interested in music. You want him as a musician and not necessarily as an engineer, because you get the engineering for free in any case. It's always there. So we keep changing these positions between landscape architecture, arts, philosophy, writers, and all of a sudden you have this big kind of setting of people, and all of a sudden the different interests and the notions that these people try to portray becomes part of the creative process. To be quite honest, is not enough to bring specialists around the same table.
Right.
You have to go deeper. You really, and a lot of orchestras around the world actually rehearse on each other's instruments.
Right.
For them to understand, who am I playing with when I'm playing with the guy playing the trumpet if I play the clarinet? And by doing that during rehearsals, you understand more what is this teamwork about. You actually move away from your position and you move into another one.
Right.
And you take it on and you understand all of a sudden, okay, so this is what it's about. And then during the concert, of course, everyone goes back to their original instrument.
Right. So is it a form of role playing then?
So this is happening, in the conceptual and creative phases to a large extent, where the basic solutions are coming. And we like to say we talk about the projects a long time before we start sketching.
Right.
Because in the sketch, there's a lot of power. Let's say me starting Snøhetta and I sketch something and give it to someone else, I've made a decision already. So we like the fact that we talk about it and use words in order to describe how to talk about it. We have some few internal statements like, okay, it's about the person in the collective. So everyone is contributing to the collective. It's about changing positions in the creative work. It's about reinventing yourself.
What are the dividends of this process? I mean, give me an example of an innovation or a feature or something that comes out of this integration that would not if it hadn't been practiced, this transpositioning that you're talking about.
No, I think a lot of our objects have come from this, especially breaking down the barriers between landscape architecture and architecture, and as the years have gone by, also within design, interior architecture, and so forth. But the last few years, we've started calling architecture and landscape architecture the art of prepositions.
Right.
Simply because everything is about body location. And in nature, all prepositions are present in almost any language in the world. Start testing the languages you know, and you will find out that in order to locate yourself and to communicate to others also where you are, you need the prepositions. I'm behind the house. I'm in front of the car. I'm under the water. Hard to communicate, of course, but you get my point.
Yes.
And all these prepositions are related to body locations in relationship to the surroundings. And it's a way of defining your position in the world. Because your eyes are always where the horizon is. If you're 200 meters up, the horizon is with you 200 meters up, right? So it always goes straight through your eyes. So you're locating yourself based on principles in nature of locating bodies to protect yourself or to be not protective, to be exposed. And by doing that, you're developing an intimacy with the surroundings, which you can normally only have in landscapes. You cannot have that except for interiors. And I think it's extremely important, this intimacy that then generates some sort of public ownership to a project by almost creating landscape, nature feelings in persons, but not copying nature.
Which project do you think best represents this integration?
There are many projects, but maybe a breaking point for a lot of people who come to Oslo is obviously the Opera House. It takes on a new, complete typology within a setting of performing art and ballet theaters that integrates the public in a different way. Opera and ballet houses have a particular understanding, the content of the opera and ballet, which is normally played inside, and they have a tendency of being extremely classical. You have a front plaza, everyone walking up to the front plaza, you come through a central door, you have a double stairway up to the galleries, then you come in and you hear the same 14 operas over and over again. So I think breaking with where the expectation of typologies and architectural typologies is high, breaking it exactly there is a big point. Because that shows the possibility for so many other typologies to follow.
So what does the form of this building do that changes that paradigm, but also brings architecture and landscape together?
Now, first of all, in the whole discussion at the very beginning on the Opera House, of course, we had the musicians involved in the workshop. We had the person who writes the librettos for new operas. We had authors. We had directors. And these came together. And of course, everyone have a picture of an opera in their head. Before you even start, you have a picture of what an opera is in your head.
Right.
So only in the workshop communication along these lines, with partially our experience, say from the library in Alexandria, which was already sort of intersecting with the ground, we said, okay, what if this intersection between the building and the water is a kind of mediator between sea, building, and sky? And that gave us the landscape that you can walk on. So you can walk all over the roof of the Opera House, slowly climbing up. Right now we call it the Granny's route because it's not that hard. And we're basically breaking with all building regulations because artists did the roof. And art does not have to follow building regulations. So now it's a free and quite vivid space that you walk on top of.
Right.
And the idea was to lower the threshold for new users. Let's say you use the roof the first time, then you go into the lobby the second time, and the third time maybe you go into a performance.
Right.
But allowing people to get onto the roof gave them the possibility of sitting down on it, sitting on the opera, laying down on the opera, walking on the opera. So already here we introduced another sort of body position in relationship to terminology of opera. And what happens when you create this way of sitting at something and touching it, you can own it. It's like when you go to a restaurant and you sit down at a chair in that restaurant. While you're sitting in that chair, it's your chair. But when you get up and leave the restaurant, it goes back to the ownership of the restaurant. Right. So it's this type of emotional ownership, emotional closeness to objects, surroundings that we wanted to emphasize. And by doing that, we have reached a certain level of public ownership to that particular building simply by changing accessibility.
Let's talk about one more project type. And this is the one where you talk about exceptionally high environmental targets. Can you perhaps walk me through one of, say, the Powerhouse projects and what's achieved there?
I think maybe the latest one, and now we have a couple of others ongoing, and we're exporting it out of Norway. But I mean, the Telemark Powerhouse is probably, let's say, one that at least would give us best possibility of understanding what this is about. It's a very freestanding building in the middle of a totally different environment of buildings. It's standing there, either proud or shy, I don't know, but it's doing the job. And it really is producing a lot more energy than it consumes. And it's, the Powerhouse system we started together with Skanska and some others about 13 years ago. And the idea was to be able to design and build buildings that at least would be fully CO2 neutral after a lifespan of somewhere between 25 and 30 years.
Right.
And in order to do that, first, you have to look at the energy consumption of that building. You have to look at passive strategies for that building. You have to look at maintenance and the CO2 footprint of maintenance and exchange of elements. You have to look at the production line, obviously, of energy that you're dealing with, and how much technology goes into that particular building. So the whole embodied material consumption and production line needs to be calculated up against each other for us to be able to meet that goal. And Telemark is a good example. It's this mushroom in the middle of everything.
Right.
And it does the job. It really does. And then all of a sudden you see, okay, this typology I mentioned earlier, form follows environment to an extent, the solar panels just to be very efficient, especially in the Nordic region in a context, okay, they have to be angled a bit, you have to get the most out of the sun. You have to produce more than 630 kilowatt hours on a photovoltaic solar panel for that panel at least to pay back its own footprint. That's one of the big dilemmas. And during a lifespan of let's say 30 years, you have to balance the change of photovoltaic panels once. And that has to be part of the calculation. So the Powerhouse system is trying to do that at all levels. And the calculations are conservative. So for many of the powerhouses now, and the same with Telemark, we're performing better than the calculations.
All right.
And I think that's interesting because engineers have a lot of discrepancy in every calculation. They want to be on the safe side. They don't want to promise something you can't deliver. So they're conservative. But, there are typologies of buildings, especially in the office segment. It's a little more difficult with housing because the individual comfort zone is so different from family to family, person to person. But we're doing that for the moment also. But I think especially in all these thousands and thousands of square meters office buildings that are being built, there it's totally simple.
The building, the photovoltaic on the roof and the south-facing facade of the building produces, 256 megawatt hours each year, something in that order?
Yeah, that's around that size, yes. And remember, every place on Earth has the same amount of daylight. It's just distributed differently throughout the year. So part of the system is how to deliver this overproduction during the summer in the Nordic countries back to the grid.
Right, so the grid becomes the battery.
Yes.
Yes, but I think the number that a lot of people don't appreciate, and I've worked in a net zero energy building in Singapore, is that in order to be net positive, you really have to bring energy consumption down. And so the Powerhouse building is 70% better, or consumes 70% of a base case building of an equivalent size.
And that's the starting point for making this work. Otherwise the surface amount of that building would not have space enough to produce. If you were working along a consumption of a normal office building, we would not have enough space to have enough photovoltaics, not even with a heat exchange or whatever.
Right. And that's another really important part of the equation, that there is heat exchange with geothermal. And so there's 11-story building, which has this kind of chiseled roof and a kind of a cutout entrance on the east facade. It's kind of like almost a science fiction-y kind of object. Produces 20 times the amount of energy that an average Norwegian household will need. And it just pumps energy into the grid in a surplus. That's pretty impressive. Now, I was looking at some of the comments about this project on a couple of media platforms, and there was a conversation on how it looks.
Yes.
And some were pretty harsh in their opinion. The word ugly was used. Do you think beauty matters in this conversation on science and performance and sustainability?
Yes, I think it matters. I think beauty is a deep and kind of humanistic driver. There are simply things that make you feel better simply by looking at them than others. There's no question. But that changes. That's not stable. So what I get happier looking at today is not the same as what I was looking at and getting happy 20 years ago. So aesthetics are changing with demands. It's not a stable factor. We have to acknowledge the fact that things change over time. When something's ripe, it becomes naturally beautiful. It can be choice of materials, how you deal with the details. It actually provides you with something better than was there before. We have to reinvent this situation. We have to make sure that when we react with the best possible knowledge we have today, and hopefully even better. So this building obviously is, if people call it ugly, I don't mind. I really don't mind. I think it's quite beautiful. And a lot of people would not, but there is a tendency in this world, since the architecture during the 80s and 90s and maybe early 2000s failed so dramatically in its urban and aesthetical context, because the industry itself sort of were only looking at standardized solutions, and everything where you came around the world looked the same, and same ugliness and repetitive and misunderstanding of modernism. But then, when something looks different, you would normally very fast say, ugly, not really beautiful.
As we begin to look at the building as a relational object rather than an aesthetic object, that it embodies a set of relationships with the world around it, whether it's the sun or the streetscape or the fjord, then we begin to appreciate its beauty for different reasons. We begin to find it beautiful for different reasons, right? That's my theory, that as long as people don't understand the raison d'etre of what the building is trying to do or what relations it's trying to create, then we fall back on these form, proportion, style, kind of isms of design.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to use from now on the relational objects. I think it's a good word. It actually does give the impact on how is your backbone reaction when you see something. How do you encourage people to deal with certain types of art if you hate it or love it? Can you paint a hand? And if you can't paint a hand, you can't paint any painting. It's one way of thinking about it. But relational is, I think you're absolutely right. Relational is beautiful. It has this inherent beauty in it, simply because it matches. It brings together.
It's embedded
in that, in the approach of that design, and that makes it beautiful. But you have to know.
Exactly.
I agree with you.
You have to know. Yeah. The other big idea, I think, that I read in Snøhetta writing and things that you've said is the importance of public space, of revitalizing or reviving public space. Let me just ask you, what do you think are the ingredients of good public space?
Well, first of all, public space is accessible to the public. It's not fenced in or it's not secured. It's open and accessible. It has, it offers some public amenities. It needs to have a certain density of both you feeling safe and at the same time feeling that you're comfortable in that particular location. So there is an element of friendliness in public space that is necessary, And then at the same time, of course, it varies. Is it a hardscape or is it a park? Is it green? Is it lush? Is it mono-oriented or is it complex and diversified? So the typologies of outdoor spaces is enormous, as many as we have in architecture when it comes to typologies, at least. And the public space, first of all, needs to be accessible. I think that's the starting point. If you assume that you seclude certain groups of people simply by the way you build up whatever that place has to offer, then you're already being biased towards a larger group of people. So, for instance, in Norway, the integration policies are not ideal because first they agree on their differences and then they try to agree afterwards instead of doing it the other way around. First agreeing on whatever is the same and then trying to agree on the differences later. So, in a way, there are human needs, basic human needs, that do appear in public space.
Right.
It can't be too polluted. You have to be able to breathe. You have to be able, in hot areas, to find protection against the sun. In wet areas, you have to find protection against the water. So public space is also contextual, like architecture is in many ways.
Right.
You have to react to the situations accordingly around the world and try to provide either shadow or other kinds of protection for people to feel comfortable and safe.
Right. Central to the idea of public space is the question of density, I imagine. And there can be too much density, which then compromises public space or maybe vitalizes it. I don't know. Maybe it has the inverse effect. I mean, I'm thinking of a comparison between, say, a plaza in Oslo versus a public space in Hong Kong. I mean, these are two completely different densities.
Yes.
And I wonder if Snøhetta has a position on how to think about this balance between public and private realms, or the gradation of public space that happens in different cities in different parts of the world.
Yeah, during the Corona period, the Nordic countries used to say, very unhappy with the 2 meter distance because they couldn't wait to get back to the 5. So, there is this notion of density for sure. And again, it's contextual, it's cultural.
Right.
So, of course, there's a much higher degree of density in Hong Kong and will always be. People accept more closeness. When you come to the further north you come, the bigger the distances are and the less density there is. I prefer, I have to say, the acknowledgement of a slightly higher density than what we have in the Nordic countries, simply because it's more sustainable. Right. You have the density as part of sustainability thinking. If you make a plaza and it's empty all year, you made it for nobody. You just spent the money and the CO2 in order to get there. It doesn't make sense. It increases for the one person going onto that plaza, his or her personal CO2 footprint massively. It's like flying alone on a plane. It's not ideal. So when we increase density in public spaces, it's also not only a social element to it, but there is also an environmental element to it. And I think a lot of the things that we're dealing with today have to do and are dealing with exactly the same issues, whether it's whatever is built is basically dealing with the same element.
Right. Actually, you do have a project in Hong Kong, and it has a very large central public space. What struck me about that, is that the response to density is then that the public space is elevated. It's a ground above ground, so to speak, the architecture moves in the z-axis, so to speak. the ground gets replicated. Obviously, there's not much use for that in Norway.
No, not in the same way. But I think using the city twice, whatever you do with it, or 3 times, is of course better than using it only once. I mean, that's pure economy. So to some extent, when we do elevated public spaces in dense situations like AIRSIDE in Hong Kong, it's really about utilizing the ground. Because on one hand, commercial buildings should not have a footprint higher than they need, because they should not be occupying communal ground. So that's why I approve for commercial projects to go up high, whereas housing should be lower and culture should be completely low. They are allowed, if it's public culture, they are allowed to have a bigger footprint. Housing could be in between, but commercials should go up high because they are not allowed to take more of the Earth's surface than necessary. And that's why you have to provide public space in any case. So then it makes sense to use the site 2 or 3 times by elevated public access at different levels in order for people to engage with the building again.
Right.
And I think both the public spaces outside and inside then become extremely important also for commercial buildings, like in Hong Kong. But on the other hand, you can always ask the question, does it make a difference then? You can always say, so who are you actually providing a better world for by doing elevated? Only those people who can afford and buy things in these shops, or what? So it's a semi-private situation usually, because you are already, you don't allow for full diversity in a high-end building. It's almost impossible, because only people who can afford to be there are there.
Right.
And they will utilize the public space differently. So it's almost like semi-private, or semi-public at least.
Well, if I remember Hong Kong, a lot of the elevated public spaces are 24/7 free to access.
Yeah.
I mean, but
Hong Kong is actually quite good at dealing with its public in the high density they have.
Right.
Because they have this precision in the transition between the city and the jungle, which is absolutely fascinating. I mean, in Hong Kong, it's like within a meter of a facade, you have the jungle.
Yes.
It's fantastic.
Which project do you think represents urban renewal through the revitalization of public space?
Well, I think in our case, it's definitely Times Square, because in New York, because it was so full of traffic, I mean, it was like overloaded completely.
Kjetil, if I may, just to recap, large swaths of area around 42nd and 47th Streets were pedestrianized. And so you basically doubled the amount of public space, got rid of the curbs, got rid of the clutter, introduced seating and benches and so on.
And you asked the question earlier, what needs to be in a public space? Well, what doesn't need to be there are cars. Because cars have a footprint that ruin everything that is dealing with true city life. They're only about driving and parking. And whatever they do, they take too much space. So when the cars were removed through Jan Gehld's first studies on the pedestrianization of Times Square, there was a clear indication that this would probably only have a positive effect on Times Square per se, and how it was used, not only by tourists, but also by the inhabitants of New York. And what happens then, when you remove the cars, you locate a body in a position where before there were only cars. So you see your city in a new way. All of a sudden you're located in a place where you've never ever been in your city, except inside a car driving through. It's crazy, and we saw that. We were providing the benches and the public amenities that were there for people. They would get up on the benches and stand on the benches to have full view of this new position in the middle of Times Square, where before there were only cars and buses and whatever. And it's crazy. They see the city, their own city, in a new way.
the removal of cars, according to the data, suggests that pedestrian injuries dropped by something like 40%. Accidents were reduced by 15%. The one that surprised me the most, and the first two are expected, but the third one was the crime rate decreased by 20%. I don't understand why crime would go down because cars are gone out, but that is
it's actually less aggressive.
Less aggressive, right? Okay.
I would say, the way of hiding away, you have more public watching every square meter of Times Square. I wouldn't say public control, but it's definitely a way of reacting towards the atmosphere that is being generated there. And in addition to that, of course, pollution went down massively. Air pollution.
Right.
And the turnover for the shops went up.
Right.
So there wasn't really one measurable negative consequence. And the interesting thing was they did not even predict where these cars that were no longer able to drive along Times Square, where they would go. So they just blocked it. And the cars, it's like water. Right. They found a way around. But nobody knew where they were going to go.
But there was an additional congestion in the area, on the surrounding areas as a result of the new pedestrian.
Yes, of course. And of course, impatience. So there's always a knock-on effect somewhere, but not to the extent that Manhattan didn't work.
I mean, I find it really fascinating that this is an example of several projects in the world where the removal of cars has created a win-win-win situation. Cheonggyecheon in Seoul, South Korea comes to mind, where again the removal of a highway and turning it into a park and a pedestrian space did exactly that. It actually increased ridership of public transportation, which was another surprising thing, apart from diminishing pollution and improving health. But so it seems this is a trend we're seeing in many parts of the world. I mean, I was struck by something you said, which seems like an oxymoron. It's not as simple as good ends justify bad means. It's much more complicated than that. It's not bad against good. It's good against good. I thought, what does that mean?
It's one of the typical dilemmas, let's say. One example would be downtown Oslo, in a beautiful street there called Bygdøy Allé. The environmentalists wanted to chop down all the chestnut trees in order to create bicycle roads. Right? How do you react to that? Okay, you get 50,000 more people to ride bicycles instead of cars, but you chop down hundreds of trees to get there, to make that happen. Now, I don't know which choice is the right. Both have good intentions. And that's the type of dilemmas we are confronted with all the time. Here, again, back to Europe and Norway, with the wind turbines. We do know that huge 200-meter tall wind turbines have an effect on nature. We do know that the roads they're building in order to get to these wind turbines is ruining very vulnerable landscapes. But we also know that these turbines are producing clean energy. And we don't really know the embodied energy of a wind turbine. It's never really been gone through and calculated 100%. So we don't know yet how much energy some of these turbines have to produce in order for them to pay back even their own footprint. So these are the dilemmas.
Yes.
And there is no obvious solution to it. It's very, very complex, very complicated. Food production worldwide, we have to make some major choices, maybe even to the extent that we cannot solve everything at the same time. So there needs to be a stepwise. But I was very happy when now biodiversity was introduced into the UN Charter, because simply you have to do more than one thing. And that's why knowledge base back into the profession is so important, and cross professional work, because it's impossible for a person to be that knowledgeable and sit and understand this whole complex picture.
Yes,
you need
exactly.
to work together with others in order to get there.
Yes.
This podcast that we're having right now has a pretty big CO2 footprint. Okay, maybe the message is important, so it's worthwhile. So if you look at our new webpage, you can choose how big you want a footprint you want to leave when you're using our webpage. And you can, at the bottom of it, also get into a calculation program to see how big your footprint on our webpage was. You know, I mean, there is about 2 tons of raw material going into a laptop. And the funny thing is, we need the laptop, we need the computers in order to calculate what to do with climate change.
Versus good problem.
It is the good versus good. It is the dilemma. And I don't think we've come out of the situation where we can go back and say, okay, resilience is not only about creating a massively sort of a utopian good life for everyone, but it's reaching at least slightly above a minimum worldwide. The Nordic countries with the Nordic model have for a long period of time been promoting equality, women's rights. But you know, we are still taking on, maybe with the Ukrainians now a little bit more, but let's say 40,000 people a year from outside of our borders. Excuse me, what the heck? You know, we have so much space. And I think the Nordic model is not a model for the world. It's too demanding. There's too much of everything. It's too utopian. I think we have to find a different model.
Before I wrap up, let's take a peek at the beginnings of Snøhetta, shall we? It was a remarkable start. You won the competition for the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, Egypt, 1989, yes. Your partner, Greg Dykers, who I met at the Wholesome Awards in Venice, said once that the thing that kept you going was your naivete. Any smart person would have walked away.
Oh, yeah.
What was that like, having a project of this magnitude and being that young and that green, so to speak, in the business? What was that like? What were some of the conflicts that you faced getting this off the ground? I mean, give me an anecdote.
I really don't know where to start, but you know, it could be anything from Craig's first bicycle falling apart after 200 meters. You know, first the pedals, then the seat, then the steering wheel, and you know, things were. It was hard, no question. We had just bought our first 14 computers to produce the whole project on AutoCAD 11. And, you know, these were gateway computers. I don't know if you remember them. They had this cow kind of pattern on them. So they looked like black and white cows. Well, in any case, our engineer, Mamdou Hamza, had built us an office on top of this, a complete glass house in Cairo.
In Cairo, yes.
I mean, it was hot. Sorry, I don't know if I should say that, but it was hot like hell. You know, it was absolutely amazing. But then, against all odds, one night it started pouring with rain.
Right.
And the building was leaking, you know, all over. The computers got completely soaked. All the original materials got soaked. I mean, the water, you know, you could basically raft down the stairs.
Gosh.
So we managed to get the water out. Then we went to the neighbors to collect hair dryers. And we dried up all the computers as much as we could. And they lasted exactly for a year and a half. And then they all said at the same time. And they imploded, basically, on us. But we had finished in DD. So then there was a building site ongoing. So we had to, unfortunately, get rid of this first 14 computers that we had.
Yeah. Can you laugh about it now?
Yeah, we laughed about it then already, almost.
Last question. What gives you hope?
I have a positive attitude. You know, I think we've mentioned it earlier today, but next generation gives me hope. They're extremely more knowledgeable than we were, same age. They're pushing the boundaries. They have opinions on things. They do understand. The only thing I'm afraid of is if they become too afraid and become passive. So right now they have to push this kind of knowledge base they have and the understanding they have into conscious action. And I think they will. There is this period of time when you're 22, 23, 24, where you should be uncertain, And then I hope for all the other architects around the world, if you are nicely settled in their chairs, that they become more radical and not more conservative as they grow older.
Well, thank you so much, Kjetil. I really enjoyed listening to you. I think you have a lot of amazing ideas.
Thank you, Nirmal. It's been a pleasure. I mean, sometimes you get interviewed by people who have just prepared the questions and don't understand the background of their questions. I mean, you're so deep into this. You really do understand every bit and piece of it.
Well, thank you for saying that. If you're in Singapore, I hope you will give me a call.
It happens.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Kjetil. It was a great pleasure. I'd also like to thank all of you for tuning in. There is much more about this episode waiting to be unpacked at ecogradia.com, where you can also find all our past episodes, their summaries, galleries, and notes on dedicated pages from season 1 up to now. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe or leave us a comment. Your good words matter and could in fact pique the interest of others, their friends, colleagues, or maybe guests on our wish list. Your support can help the podcast grow and keep sustainability on everyone's radar. Until we meet next, this is Nirmal Kishnani signing off in Singapore.